Some truths are buried so deep, we spend our whole lives unknowingly carrying them. For Clay Hargrove, that truth lived just beneath the skin of his neck, waiting 45 years to surface. The cowboy had ignored the small lump for months, telling himself it was nothing more than hard living catching up with him. When it finally grew painful enough to send him to a doctor, he expected a simple procedure and a quick recovery. Instead, the surgeon's blade revealed something impossible, a tiny metal device with numbers that matched no medical database. Within hours, Clay found himself in a hospital room with federal agents asking questions about an orphanage fire from 1985. They showed him newspaper clippings of children who had died, and one face looked disturbingly familiar. The life he remembered, the name he carried, even his earliest childhood memories, everything began crumbling as the agents pressed him for answers he didn't have. What scared Clay most wasn't the device they'd pulled from his neck, but the growing certainty that someone had been watching him his entire life. What did they want from a simple horse trainer living in the middle of nowhere? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clay Hargrove's hands moved with the same steady confidence they possessed for 23 years, working the lead rope as the young Mustang tested his patience. The morning sun cast long shadows across the corral, painting the New Mexico landscape in shades of amber and rust. At 45, Clay had learned that horses, like most things worth understanding, required time and respect rather than force. "Easy now, girl," he murmured, his voice carrying the weathered calm of a man who'd spent decades earning trust from creatures that had every reason to fear humans. The mare's ears flicked forward, then back, as she processed his tone. Her nostrils flared, testing his scent for danger signs that weren't there. The leather journal tucked into his back pocket, pressed against his hip as he moved, a constant companion filled with observations about each horse's temperament, progress notes, and the occasional philosophical musing about the nature of wildness versus freedom. Every morning, for the past 5 years, Clay had filled those pages with careful handwriting, documenting not just his work, but the rhythm of a life lived deliberately. From the edge of the corral, Sarah Martinez watched with the appreciative eye of someone who understood good horsemanship. At 38, she ran the feed store in town and had known Clay longer than most, long enough to recognize when something was bothering him, even when he tried to hide it behind his usual stoic demeanor. "That lump on your neck's gotten bigger," she said without preamble, the way only an old friend could. She leaned against the fence rail, her dark hair caught by the morning breeze. Clay's hand moved instinctively to his neck, fingers finding the swelling that had been growing steadily. "For 3 months. It's nothing. Nothing doesn't keep getting bigger, Clay." Sarah's tone carried the gentle persistence of someone who'd watched too many stubborn men ignore their bodies until it was too late. "My uncle had something similar. Turned out to be your uncle smoked 3 packs a day and drank himself to sleep every night." Clay's interruption came without heat, but with finality. "This isn't the same thing." The Mustang chose that moment to test the boundaries, pulling hard against the lead rope. Clay absorbed the motion with practiced ease, neither fighting the mare's energy nor surrendering to it. The dance between human and horse had always made more sense to him than most human interactions. Animals were honest about their intentions. They didn't pretend to be something they weren't. "Dr. Martinez could take a look at it," Sarah pressed, naming her cousin who ran the small medical clinic 15 miles closer to town, "just to put your mind at ease." Clay led the mare in a slow circle, watching her gait for signs of the old injury that had brought her to his ranch. A previous owner had been too quick with spurs and too slow with patience, leaving the horse with trust issues that reminded Clay uncomfortably of his own relationship with medical professionals. Doctors always find something wrong. That's how they stay in business. The truth was more complicated. though Clay would never admit it aloud. Hospitals made him uneasy in ways he couldn't fully explain. The smell of antiseptic, the harsh fluorescent lighting, the constant beeping of machinery, it all triggered a vague anxiety that felt older than his conscious memories. He'd avoided medical care for most of his adult life, treating everything, from broken bones to infected cuts, with the practical remedies learned from ranch work and necessity. "You're impossible," Sarah said, but her exasperation was tempered with genuine affection. She'd been trying to wear down his stubborn independence for years, not because she wanted to change him, but because she recognized the loneliness that drove it. "So people keep telling me." Clay brought the mar to a halt and rewarded her cooperation with a gentle stroke along her neck. "But impossible seems to be working out fine so far." Sarah studied his profile, noting the way he favored his left, sighed slightly, a habit that had developed over the past few weeks as the lump made certain movements uncomfortable. Clay Hargrove was the most self-reliant person she'd ever known, capable of fixing anything from truck engines to broken hearts. But he had a blind spot when it came to his own welfare. The ranch house behind them stood as testimony to Clay's preference for solving problems himself. Every board, every shingle, every coat of paint had been applied by his own hands over the years. The structure wasn't fancy, but it was solid and honest, much like the man who'd built it. A wide porch wrapped around the front, its wooden chairs worn smooth by countless evenings spent watching the sun disappear behind the distant mountains. "Miguel's bringing 3 more horses next week," Clay said, changing the subject with the subtle skill of someone accustomed to deflecting unwanted attention. "Owner says they're broken the saddle, but Miguel thinks they've been mishandled." "More rescue cases?" Sarah's tone softened. She knew Clay's reputation for taking on horses that other trainers had given up on. Word spread quietly through the network of ranchers and horse owners about the man who could gentle even the most damaged animals. Something like that. Clay released the Mustang into the larger paddock, watching as she immediately sought the company of 2 other rescued horses. Animals understood the value of community in ways that sometimes escaped their human counterparts. Seems like there's always more broken things than people willing to fix them properly. The observation carried weight beyond its surface meaning. Clay had built his life around the principle of patient restoration, taking things that have been hurt or discarded and giving them time to heal. It was work that required a particular kind of faith, the belief that with enough care and consistency, almost anything could learn to trust again. Sarah recognized the philosophy, but also saw how Clay applied it to everything except himself. "When's the last time you took a day off?" "Don't need days off from work you enjoy." "Everyone needs rest, Clay, even you." He turned to face her fully, his gray eyes holding the kind of steady directness that made people either trust him completely or look away. "I rest plenty. Sleep 8 hours every night, take my time with meals, sit on the porch every evening watching the world wind down. What more rest does a man need?" It was a reasonable answer, but Sarah heard what he wasn't saying. Clay's version of rest still involved being useful, productive, engaged with work that mattered. He'd never learned the art of simply existing without purpose, and she suspected he was afraid to try. Stillness might allow, too, many uncomfortable questions to surface. The distant rumble of a diesel engine announced the arrival of Pete Gonzalez, Clay's only regular employee and the closest thing he had to family. At 62, Pete had worked cattle ranches most of his life before age and arthritis had forced him into lighter duties. Clay had hired him 3 years ago, ostensibly to help with the heavier work, but really because he'd recognized a kindred spirit in the older man's stubborn pride. "Morning, Sarah." "Clay." Pete's greeting came with the economical nod of someone who believed actions spoke louder than words. He'd already assessed the morning's work, noting which horses needed attention and what tasks required his immediate focus. "Pete." Clay's response carried genuine warmth. In the hierarchy of his affections, Pete ranked just below the horses and considerably above most humans. Thought we'd work with Thunder this morning. He's been testing his boundaries again. Thunder was a 7-year-old gelding with a history of throwing riders not from meanness, but from a deep-seated need to establish that he couldn't be dominated. Clay had been working with him for 6 months, making slow but steady progress toward the kind of partnership that respected both horse and human. "That boy's got opinions," Pete observed, his weathered face creasing into something approximating a smile. "Reminds me of someone else I know." The gentle ribbing was as close to open affection as either man would allow, but Sarah caught that underlying fondness that connected them. They shared the comfortable silence of people who'd learned to communicate without wasting words, each understanding his role in the rhythm of ranch life. As the morning progressed, Sarah watched Clay work. With Thunder, noting the unconscious way he protected his neck from sudden movements. The lump was clearly causing more discomfort than he'd admit, but she also recognized the futility of pushing too hard. Clay Hargrove changed his mind in his own time, for his own reasons, and no amount of outside pressure would accelerate that process. The sun climbed higher, painting the landscape in the harsh, honest light that revealed everything without sentiment. Clay's world was defined by this clarity, the straightforward relationship between effort and result, the reliable cycle of seasons, the honest exhaustion that came from physical work done well. It was a life he'd built deliberately, far from the complexities and compromises that seemed to define modern existence. But as Sarah prepared to leave for the feed store, she couldn't shake the feeling that Clay's carefully constructed simplicity was about to be tested in ways none of them could anticipate. The lump on his neck represented more than a medical inconvenience. It was a crack in the foundation of his self-sufficient world, a reminder that some problems couldn't be solved through patience and determination alone. "Think about what I said," she called as she walked toward her truck. Clay touched his neck again, feeling the swelling that had grown impossible to ignore. For a man accustomed to healing others, the prospect of needing healing himself felt like admitting defeat. But as he watched Sarah drive away, dust settling in her wake, he found himself considering the possibility that even the most independent souls sometimes needed help. The thought scared him more than he cared to admit. The decision came 3 weeks later, when Clay woke at 4 in the morning with pain shooting down his left arm like lightning. The lump had doubled in size overnight. The skin stretched tight and angry red around its edges. When he tried to turn his head to check the bedside clock, agony exploded through his neck and shoulder, leaving him gasping in the pre-dawn darkness. Sarah found him 2 hours later, still sitting on the edge of his bed, unable to move without triggering waves of pain that left him nauseated and shaking. She'd come by to discuss feed orders and found the front door unlocked, Clay's morning routine abandoned for the first time in memory. "We're going to the hospital," she said, her voice brooking no argument. Right now. For once, Clay didn't fight her. The pain had stripped away his usual defenses, leaving him vulnerable in ways that went beyond the physical. As Sarah helped him into her truck, he caught his reflection in the passenger window and barely recognized the gray-faced man staring back at him. St. Vincent's Regional Medical Center sat on the outskirts of Albuquerque like a modern fortress of glass and steel. Clay had driven past it countless times over the years, but never imagined himself as a patient within its walls. The emergency room bustled with controlled chaos, nurses moving between curtained alcoves, monitors beeping their electronic rhythms. The constant murmur of medical terminology that sounded like a foreign language to his ears. Dr. Patricia Coleman appeared at his bedside within 30 minutes of his arrival, a competent manner immediately putting him at ease despite his hospital anxiety. In her mid-40s with prematurely silver hair and intelligent brown eyes, she possessed the rare combination of technical expertise and genuine compassion that marked the best physicians. "Mr. Hargrove, I'm Dr. Coleman. Can you tell me when you first noticed this swelling?" Her hands moved gently around his neck, probing the mass with professional thoroughness. Clay found himself responding to her straightforward approach, answering questions he'd deflected from others for months. The medical chart she assembled told the story of a man who'd lived 45 years, while avoiding medical care almost entirely. No childhood vaccination records, no family medical history, no previous hospitalizations or surgeries. It was as if Clay Hargrove had sprung into existence as a healthy adult, with no medical past to guide treatment decisions. "We'll need to get this removed as soon as possible," Dr. Coleman explained after reviewing his CT scan. "The mass is pressing on several critical structures. I'm concerned about potential vascular compromise." Clay studied the ghostly images on the computer screen, seeing his own anatomy reduced to shadows and highlights. The lump appeared as a dense, irregular shape nested against his carotid artery, far more complex than he'd imagined. "How long will I be laid up?" he asked, already calculating the impact on his horses and ranch operations. "With a straightforward removal, you should be back to light duty within a week." Dr. Coleman's tone carried the confident reassurance of someone who'd performed the procedure dozens of times. "We'll have you feeling much better very soon." The surgery was scheduled for the following morning. Clay spent a restless night in the preoperative ward, surrounded by sounds and smells that triggered vague, uncomfortable memories he couldn't quite grasp. Every time he drifted towards sleep, fragments of dreams would surface through corridors. Hushed voices, the sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. Sarah stayed until visiting hours ended, her presence providing an anchor of familiarity in the clinical environment. "The horses will be fine," she assured him for the third time. "Pete's got everything under control." "I know." Clay's response was automatic, but his mind was elsewhere, wrestling with an anxiety that seemed disproportionate to the situation. "It's just this place makes me feel like I'm forgetting something important." "Like what?" "If I knew that, I wouldn't be forgetting it." The surgery began at 7 a.m. sharp. Dr. Coleman had assembled a small team for what should have been a routine procedure. A resident, an anesthesiologist, and a surgical nurse who'd worked these operations dozens of times. Clay went under general anesthesia, expecting to wake up relieved and healing. Instead, he woke to find Dr. Coleman's face pale with shock and two men in dark suits standing at the foot of his bed. The first indication something had gone wrong came from Dr. Coleman's expression. In 30 years of medicine, she'd seen tumors, cysts, infected lymph nodes, and every variation of growth that could develop in human tissue. She'd never seen anything like the object she'd removed from Clay Hargrove's neck. The device was roughly the size of a thumbnail, composed of an alloy that didn't appear in any medical database. Its surface was etched with numbers that formed no pattern she could recognize, and embedded within its core was circuitry so sophisticated it belonged in a laboratory rather than a human body. Most disturbing of all, the device had been surgically implanted with a precision that suggested extensive medical training and resources. "Mr. Hargrove," she said carefully, "we need to discuss what we found." Clay's throat felt raw from the breathing tube, his voice emerging as a hoarse whisper. "What's wrong?" "The mass we removed wasn't organic tissue. It was a manufactured device that had been surgically implanted, probably when you were very young based on the tissue integration we observed." The words seemed to come from a great distance. Clay struggled to process their meaning while his mind remained foggy from anesthesia. "That's impossible." "I thought so too until I saw it myself." Dr. Coleman pulled up his post-surgical images. On the bedside monitor, the device was integrated into your lymphatic system in a way that suggests whoever placed it had extensive knowledge of human anatomy. The two men at the foot of his bed chose that moment to introduce themselves. Agent Rivera, a woman in her 30s with sharp eyes and an air of barely controlled intensity, stepped forward first. "Mr. Hargrove, I'm Agent Rivera with the Department of Homeland Security. This is Agent Walsh from the FBI. We need to ask you some questions about the device Dr. Coleman removed." Clay's vision was still clearing, but he could see enough to recognize that neither agent looked like they were bearing good news. Agent Walsh, older and more weathered than his partner, carried himself with the cautious alertness of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. "I don't know anything about any device," Clay said, his voice growing stronger as the anesthesia wore off. "I thought it was just a cyst or something. When were you born, Mr. Hargrove?" Agent Rivera asked, consulting a file folder that seemed unnaturally thick for someone with Clay's supposedly simple history. "June 15th, 1978. You can check my birth certificate." The agents exchanged a look that Clay didn't like. Agent Walsh opened his own folder and spread several photographs across the hospital bed's rolling table. Clay found himself staring at newspaper clippings from 1985, their yellowed edges speaking the decades of careful preservation. "Do you recognize this?" Agent Rivera asked, pointing to a front-page article with the headline, "7 Children Die in Mercy House Fire." Clay studied the grainy photograph on a burning building, trying to summon any memory of the scene. Nothing came, but something about the image made his chest tight with inexplicable anxiety. "Should I?" "Look at this photo," Agent Walsh said, sliding another clipping forward. This one showed a group of children standing outside what appeared to be the same building before the fire. 7 young faces looked back at the camera with expressions ranging from curious to cautious. Clay's breath caught in his throat. The boy in the center of the photograph bore an unmistakable resemblance to his own childhood photos, if he'd had any childhood photos to compare it to. The realization hit him like cold water. He couldn't remember a single photograph of himself before age 12. "The boy in this picture was named David Chun," Agent Rivera said quietly. "He was 8 years old when Mercy House burned down. According to official records, he died in that fire along with 6 other children." Clay stared at the photograph, feeling something shift deep in his chest. The boy's eyes held a familiar wariness, the same guarded expression Clay recognized from his own mirror. "That's not possible. My name is Clay Hargrove. I was born in Roswell." "Mr. Hargrove," Agent Walsh said, his tone gentler than his partner's, "we need you to think very carefully. Do you have any memories before age 12? Any family photographs, school records, medical records?" The questions hit Clay like physical blows because he couldn't answer them. His earliest clear memories began around 6th grade, living with an elderly couple named Frank and Martha Hargrove, who'd claimed to be distant relatives taking in an orphan boy. He'd never questioned the gaps in his earlier childhood, accepting them as the natural result of trauma and time. "I need to make some phone calls," Clay said, reaching for the bedside phone with hands that had begun to shake. "Mr. Hargrove, Agent," Rivera said, her voice carrying a warning. "Before you contact anyone, you should know that your phone has been monitored for the past 18 hours. Standard procedure when we encounter devices of unknown origin." The room seemed to spin around. Clay, as the implications of her words sank in. His quiet life, his carefully constructed independence, his assumption that he could control his own destiny, all of it was crumbling under the weight of revelations he couldn't begin to understand. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Right now, we just want answers," Agent Walsh replied. "Starting with anything you can remember about your childhood before 1990. Clay closed his eyes and tried to reach back into his earliest memories, searching for something solid to hold on to. Instead, he found only shadows and fragments fleeting. Images that might have been dreams, voices that carried no faces, and an overwhelming sense that the life he built was balanced on a foundation of lies. The newspaper clippings spread across Clay's hospital bed told a story he couldn't remember living. Agent Rivera had brought a manila envelope thick with documentation, police reports, fire department records, witness statements, and photographs that painted a picture of tragedy from nearly 4 decades ago. Mercy House was a private orphanage, Agent Rivera explained, settling into the bedside chair with the practiced patience of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. It housed 12 children ranging in age from 6 to 14. On November 3, 1985, a fire broke out during the night shift. 7 children died from smoke inhalation. Clay studied the photographs of the victims, each face accompanied by a brief biography that reduced entire young lives to a few sentences. David Chun, age 8, had been at Mercy House for 2 years following his parents' death in a car accident. The official record painted him as a quiet child who struggled with nightmares and had difficulty forming attachments with potential adoptive families. The 5 survivors were placed in foster care within weeks of the fire, Agent Walsh added, consulting his own set of documents. Standard procedure was to separate them to help process the trauma. David Chun was placed with Frank and Martha Hargrove in Roswell, New Mexico. The names of his supposed guardians felt strange in Clay's mouth when he tried to say them aloud. Frank and Martha Hargrove, the elderly couple he'd called Grandpa Frank and Grandma Martha for as long as he could remember. They'd been kind but distant, providing for his basic needs while maintaining an emotional reserve that he'd attributed to their advanced age and the burden of raising an unexpected child. "I need to call them," Clay said, reaching again for the bedside phone. "Mr. Hargrove," Agent Rivera's voice carried a weight that made him pause. "Frank Hargrove died in 2003. Martha passed away 2 years later. Their property was sold to settle their estate." The news hit Clay harder than expected. Despite their emotional distance, the Hargroves had been his only connection to family, his anchor in a world that often felt uncertain. Learning of their deaths and realizing he'd been living alone for nearly 2 decades, without knowing he was truly alone, left him feeling unmoored in ways he struggled to articulate. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Agent Walsh exchanged another meaningful look with his partner. "According to our records, both deaths were reported to your last known address. The notifications were returned as undeliverable." Clay tried to remember any official mail that might have gone astray, but his memory of those years was hazy. He'd moved several times during his 20s, following work opportunities and cheaper rent, never thinking to maintain forwarding addresses. For very long, the possibility that he'd missed his guardians' deaths due to his own transient lifestyle added another layer of guilt to his growing confusion. What happened to their personal effects? Photo albums? Documents about my placement with them? The estate sale records show that most personal items were disposed of or donated, Agent Rivera said. "We've been unable to locate any documentation that might help verify your identity transition from David Chen to Clay Hargrove." The phrase, identity transition, made Clay's skin crawl. It suggested something deliberate and calculated, as if his entire life had been constructed rather than simply lived. He thought about his lack of childhood photographs, the absence of school records from his early years, the way his personal history seemed to begin fully formed around age 12. "There has to be some mistake," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, he recognized their hollow ring. Too many pieces were falling into place with disturbing precision. Agent Rivera pulled out another photograph, this one showing the interior of Mercy House before the fire. Clay found himself studying the common areas, a dining room with long tables, a recreation room with worn furniture, dormitory-style bedrooms with narrow beds lined up in precise rows. Nothing about the images triggered specific memories, but they evoked a vague sense of institutional familiarity that made him uncomfortable. "Do you remember anything about living in a group setting?" Agent Walsh asked, watching Clay's reaction carefully. "Shared meals? Scheduled activities? Other children?" Clay closed his eyes and tried to reach back into his earliest memories. For a moment, he thought he caught a fragment of something, the sound of multiple voices saying grace before a meal. The feeling of sleeping in a room where other people's breathing created a constant backdrop of sound. But when he tried to focus on the memory, it slipped away like smoke. "I remember being hungry a lot," he said suddenly, surprising himself with the admission. "Not starving, but never quite full. And I remember being told to be quiet during certain hours." The agents made notes, but their expressions suggested these details weren't unexpected. Agent Rivera consulted her file again before asking, "Do you recall any medical procedures? Visits to doctors or nurses?" The question triggered something deeper, a spike of anxiety that seemed disproportionate to simple medical care. Clay found himself touching his neck where the device had been removed, remembering the inexplicable dread he'd always felt around hospitals and medical professionals. "I was always healthy," he said. "Never needed much medical attention." According to the Mercy House records we've recovered, David Chun received regular medical checkups, Agent Walsh said, more frequently than typical for healthy children. The documentation suggests he was part of some kind of ongoing health study. The phrase health study made Clay's stomach turn. He thought about the device that had been nested in his neck for decades, so perfectly integrated with his tissue that its removal had required surgical precision. The idea that he might have been subjected to medical experimentation as a child opened up possibilities too terrible to fully consider. What kind of study? "The records are incomplete," Agent Rivera admitted. Mercy House was privately funded, and much of their documentation was destroyed in the fire. What we've pieced together suggests they were conducting research into childhood, development, and psychological adaptation. Clay stared at the ceiling tiles, trying to process information that seemed to belong in a nightmare rather than his actual life. The fluorescent lights buzzed with the same frequency he'd been hearing since waking up, a sound that seemed to resonate somewhere deep in his bones. Hospital sounds. Institutional sounds. Sounds that his body recognized even when his mind couldn't. "Place them. I want to see where I lived," he said suddenly. "The Hargrove property. I want to see if there's anything left." Agent Walsh consulted his watch. "You're scheduled for discharge tomorrow morning. We can arrange for you to visit the property, but we'll need to accompany you." "Am I under arrest?" "No, Mr. Hargrove, but the device we found represents a significant security concern. Until we understand its purpose and origin, we need to ensure your safety and the safety of others." The clinical language couldn't disguise the reality of his situation. Clay Hargrove, or David Chen, or whoever he really was, had become a person of interest in an investigation he didn't understand, connected to events he couldn't remember, carrying technology that shouldn't exist in his body as evening approached. And the agents prepared to leave for the night. Clay found himself alone with questions that multiplied faster than he could process them. The newspaper clippings remained spread across his bed like pieces of a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. 7 dead children, 5 survivors scattered to the winds, and a quiet orphan boy who had somehow become a middle-aged horse trainer, with no memory of the transition. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of fire and smoke, of small hands reaching through darkness, and of voices calling a name he couldn't quite hear. Clay's homecoming felt like returning to a stranger's life. His ranch, which had been the center of his world for over 2 decades, now seemed like an elaborate stage set designed to support a fiction he'd unknowingly been living. Even his horses sensed the change, approaching him with the cautious curiosity they usually reserve for unfamiliar humans. Sarah was waiting on his front porch when the federal sedan pulled into his driveway. She'd been maintaining his property, with Pete's help, ensuring the animals were fed and the essential maintenance continued. But her face showed the strain of worry and unanswered questions. "The agents won't tell me anything," she said, as Clay climbed the porch steps, moving carefully to avoid stressing his healing incision. "They just said you were recovering from complications." Clay gestured toward the sedan where Agents Rivera and Walsh sat waiting with professional patience. "Turns out my complications are more complicated than anyone expected." Over the next hour, he shared what he could of his situation while the agents established their temporary surveillance post. Sarah listened with the focused attention of someone trying to absorb information that challenged everything she thought she knew about a friend's life. "So you think you might be someone else entirely?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "I don't know what to think anymore." Clay pulled his adoption papers from a filing cabinet that suddenly felt like a repository of lies. "Look at these documents. I never questioned them before, but now—" Sarah examined the papers with the careful attention of someone who'd handled enough legal documents through her business to recognize quality forgeries. The adoption decree bore all the correct official seals and signatures, but something about the typography and paper quality struck her as subtly wrong. "These don't look like government documents from the 1980s, she said slowly. "The font is too modern, and this paper stock wasn't commonly used for legal documents back then." The observation hit Clay like a physical blow. If even his adoption papers were fabricated, then every foundation of his identity was built on deception. He thought about the careful way he'd constructed his adult life, choosing isolation, avoiding close relationships, maintaining emotional distance even from people he cared about. Had those choices been his own, or had he been unconsciously following programming designed to keep him separate and unexamined? "I need to visit the old Hargrove place," he said. "Maybe there's something there that can help me understand what really happened." The drive to Roswell took 2 hours, with the federal agents following at a discreet distance. Clay hadn't been back to his childhood home in over 15 years. And he was surprised by how much the surrounding area had changed. New housing developments had sprouted where he remembered empty desert, and familiar landmarks had been replaced by strip malls and chain restaurants. The Hargrove property sat on 5 acres at the end of a dirt road that had deteriorated significantly since Clay's last visit. The house itself was a modest adobe structure that had been built in the 1940s. Its walls thick enough to keep the interior cool during brutal summer heat. A new family had purchased the property after Martha's death, but they'd apparently done little to maintain the older structures. "Anything look familiar?" Agent Rivera asked as they walked around the perimeter of the house. Clay studied the landscape, searching for memories that might have been buried rather than lost. The old barn, where he'd spent countless hours reading and avoiding Frank's increasingly erratic moods. The cottonwood tree where Martha had hung a tire swing that he'd used despite being too old for such childish pleasures. The root cellar, where they'd stored vegetables and preserves, its heavy wooden door secured with a padlock that had seemed impossibly complex to his 12-year-old understanding. "The root cellar," he said suddenly. "Frank always kept it locked. Said it was dangerous for children to play in dark spaces." Agent Walsh produced a small toolkit from his jacket and made quick work of the rusted padlock. The wooden door opened with a groan of protest, revealing stone steps that descended into earthen darkness. Clay found a flashlight in his truck and led the way down into the underground chamber. The root cellar was larger than he'd expected, with stone walls that spoke to serious construction rather than simple food storage. Wooden shelves lined the walls, most empty except for a few forgotten mason jars and the detritus of decades. But in the far corner, partially hidden behind a collection of old farming equipment, Clay discovered something that made his blood run cold: a metal filing cabinet, its drawers secured with a combination lock that looked far more sophisticated than anything the elderly Hargroves would have installed. Agent Rivera photographed the cabinet from multiple angles before Agent Walsh began working on the lock with professional efficiency. "Got it," he said after several minutes of careful manipulation. The cabinet contained files that chronicled a life Clay didn't remember living. Medical records for David Chun showing regular psychological evaluations and experimental treatments. Reports from handlers documenting behavioral modifications and memory suppression techniques. And most disturbing of all, adoption documents that revealed the Hargroves hadn't been distant relatives taking in an orphan child. They'd been paid. Caregivers tasked with maintaining a specific cover identity. Jesus, Agent Rivera whispered as she photographed page after page of documentation. This is a complete identity reconstruction program. Clay found himself staring at psychological profiles that described David Chen as an exceptionally intelligent child with eidetic memory capabilities and unusual resistance to standard conditioning techniques. The reports detailed multiple attempts to suppress traumatic memories related to the Mercy House fire, with varying degrees of success. According to this, Agent Walsh said, consulting a progress report dated 6 months after the fire, the subject retained partial memories of the incident despite intensive treatment. Recommendation was to implement deeper conditioning protocols and maintain long-term monitoring. The clinical language couldn't disguise the horror of what Clay was reading. He'd been systematically brainwashed as a child, his memory suppressed, and his personality reconstructed to serve purposes he still didn't understand. The device in his neck hadn't been medical monitoring. It had been a tracking and potentially control mechanism maintained for decades. Who did this? He asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Agent Rivera flipped through more pages, looking for organizational letterheads or identifying information. Most of the documents were signed with initials rather than full names, but one file contained correspondence with a Dr. Elizabeth Crane at something called the Meridian Research Institute. Dr. Crane, she said, making notes. That's our first, real lead. As they prepared to leave the root cellar, Clay noticed something else. A small personal item that had been overlooked in the clinical documentation. A child's drawing, crude but unmistakably depicting a building on fire with stick figures running from the flames. In one corner, written in a child's careful handwriting, were the words, David's Bad Dream. The dream started 3 nights after returning from the root cellar. Clay would wake in the pre-dawn darkness with his heart hammering and sweat soaking his sheets, fragments of nightmares clinging to his consciousness like smoke. Children's voices calling for help. The smell of burning wood and melting plastic. And always, the sensation of running through corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. But worse than the dreams were the moments of unexpected clarity that came during his waking hours. Simple actions would trigger flashes of knowledge he couldn't remember acquiring. How to pick locks with improvised tools. How to move silently across different types of terrain. How to assess a room for potential threats and escape routes. Skills that had no place in the life of a horse trainer. You're different, Sarah observed as she watched him work with thunder on a crisp morning in late October. The way you move, the way you watch everything. It's like you're expecting trouble. Clay paused in his work with the gelding, becoming conscious of how he'd positioned himself to maintain clear sight lines to all approaches to the corral. He'd been doing it unconsciously for days, along with dozens of other small behavioral changes that felt both foreign and familiar. Finding out your entire life is a lie tends to make a person cautious, he said. But even as he spoke, he recognized that his new alertness went deeper than simple paranoia. His body seemed to be remembering things his mind had forgotten. Agent Rivera had been maintaining periodic contact, updating him on their investigation into Dr. Elizabeth Crane and the Meridian Research Institute. What they discovered painted a picture of a shadow organization that had operated with significant government funding during the 1980s and early 1990s. Conducting research into what they euphemistically termed enhanced human potential. We found military training manuals hidden in your belongings, Agent Rivera had told him during her last visit. Buried in your barn loft under floorboards that showed signs of recent disturbance. The manuals were classified documents dealing with survival techniques, psychological warfare, and something called deep cover identity maintenance. Clay had stared at the familiar-looking books with growing horror, realizing that some part of him recognized their contents, despite having no conscious memory of studying them. I don't remember hiding these, he'd insisted. Memory suppression techniques aren't perfect, Agent Rivera had replied. Sometimes the conditioning breaks down under stress. The trauma of discovering the device might have triggered some kind of recall protocol. The possibility that his own mind was working against him added another layer of uncertainty to Clay's already fractured sense of self. If he couldn't trust his memories, his instincts, or even his conscious choices, what foundation did he have for making decisions about his future? Pete had noticed the changes too, though he approached them with his characteristic directness. "You're carrying yourself like a soldier," the older man observed as they repaired fence line on the ranch's eastern boundary. "Seen enough of them to recognize the posture." "What do you mean?" "Way, you scan the horizon every few minutes. How you keep your back to solid objects when you're standing still. The way you've started checking your truck for what do they call it, tampering before you drive anywhere." Pete straightened slowly, his arthritis protesting the morning's work. "Question is, are you remembering being a soldier, or are you becoming one?" The distinction hit Clay harder than he'd expected. Was he recovering suppressed memories of military training, or was his conditioning reasserting itself in response to perceived threats? The difference mattered more than he could articulate, because it determined whether these emerging skills represented his true self or another layer of manipulation. That afternoon, while working alone in the barn, Clay discovered something that forced him to confront the question directly. While moving hay bales to access a broken stall door, he uncovered a hidden cache that made his blood run cold. Weapons, military-grade equipment, communication devices that looked far more sophisticated than anything a civilian should possess. And most disturbing of all, a notebook filled with his own handwriting detailed observations about his neighbors, potential security vulnerabilities in the local area, and contingency plans for various emergency scenarios. The handwriting was definitely his, but he had no memory of creating any of these documents. Agent Rivera arrived within an hour of his call, bringing Agent Walsh in what appeared to be a small army of federal technicians. They photographed and cataloged every item in the cache while Clay watched with growing dread. "The weapons are all legally purchased," Agent Walsh reported after running serial numbers through federal databases. "Bought over a period of several years using your social security number and identification. But the purchases were made in different states, suggesting a pattern of travel we can't account for." Clay studied the purchase records, noting dates that corresponded to periods when he thought he'd been focused entirely on ranch work. According to the documentation, he'd been in Phoenix buying tactical equipment on the same weekend. He clearly remembered breaking horses with Pete and Sarah. "Either I have a very detailed delusion problem, or someone's been living parts of my life without my knowledge," he said, his voice hollow with the implications. "There's a third possibility," Agent Rivera said carefully. "The conditioning might have included trigger protocol-specific situations or stimuli that would activate suppressed personality aspects. You could have been functioning as two different people without conscious awareness of the transition." The idea of involuntary personality switching was more terrifying than simple memory loss. It suggested that somewhere in his psyche David Chen might still exist as a separate entity with his own agenda and capabilities. Clay thought about the gaps in his memory, the days that seemed to compress into brief summaries, the periods of time that felt less substantial than others. "How would I know if it was happening?" "You probably wouldn't," Agent Walsh admitted. "That's the point of sophisticated conditioning. The subject maintains no conscious awareness of the alternate personality or its activities. As if summoned by their conversation, Clay felt a strange sensation wash over him, a momentary disorientation followed by the overwhelming certainty that he was being watched. His eyes swept the barn with newfound intensity, cataloging potential threats and escape routes with automatic precision. "There," he said, pointing to a shadow near the barn's eastern entrance. "Someone's been observing us from that position." For at least 10 minutes, Agent Rivera drew her weapon with practiced efficiency, but when they investigated the area, they found only scuff marks in the dirt and the faint impression of someone who had been watching from concealment. "How did you know?" Agent Walsh asked as they examined the evidence of surveillance. Clay struggled to answer. He couldn't explain the sudden certainty that had driven his observation. The way his awareness had shifted to encompass threats he couldn't consciously detect. It felt like accessing a skill set that belonged to someone else, someone who lived in his body but operated according to different rules. "I just knew," he said finally. "And that scares me more than anything else." We've discovered. The meeting with Dr. Elizabeth Crane took place in a diner outside Santa Fe, chosen for its public visibility and multiple exit routes, considerations that Clay found himself making automatically, despite having no conscious training in tradecraft. Crane arrived precisely on time. A woman in her 70s, whose sharp eyes and careful movements suggested someone accustomed to looking over her shoulder. "David," she said, settling into the booth across from him with practiced efficiency. "Though, I suppose you prefer Clay now." Agent Rivera sat 2 tables away, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough to avoid spooking their contact. Dr. Crane had agreed to the meeting only after extensive negotiations and assurances that she wouldn't be arrested for her cooperation. "You know who I am," Clay said. "It wasn't a question. I know who you were designed to be." Crane stirred sugar into her coffee with mechanical precision. "Project Shepherd was my life's work for nearly a decade. You were one of our most successful subjects." The clinical terminology made Clay's skin crawl. Subject, like a lab rat. Like a child with extraordinary potential who needed protection from forces that would have destroyed him. Crane's voice carried no apology, only the conviction of someone who believed her actions had been justified. "Do you remember what happened at Mercy House?" Clay closed his eyes and tried to reach back into the darkness of his earliest memories. Fragments surfaced: the smell of smoke, the sound of breaking glass, children's voices raised in terror. But the images felt disconnected from any emotional context, like scenes from a movie he'd watched rather than events he'd lived through. Pieces, nothing clear. That's intentional. The memories were suppressed to protect your psychological stability. Crane pulled a manila folder from her purse and slid it across the table. "But perhaps it's time you understood the full truth." The folder contained research notes written in Crane's careful handwriting, documenting experiments that made Clay's stomach turn. Project Shepherd hadn't been about helping traumatized children. It had been about creating them. The fire at Mercy House hadn't been an accident. It had been a deliberate test designed to identify which children possessed the psychological resilience necessary for advanced conditioning. "You murdered 7 children to find 5 who could survive trauma," Clay said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We saved 5 children who would have been killed anyway." Crane's tone remained clinical despite the horror of her words. "The program you were part of existed because certain elements within the government believed the Cold War required assets who could operate without the psychological limitations that hampered traditional agents." Clay thought about the weapons. Cash in his barn, the military manuals, the skills his body remembered despite his mind's ignorance. "You turned us into weapons. We gave you tools to survive in a world that had already marked you for death." Crane leaned forward, her eyes intense with remembered passion. "Your parents weren't random victims, David. They were scientists who'd discovered Project Shepherd and were planning to expose it. The car accident that orphaned you was anything but accidental. The revelation hit Clay like a physical blow. His parents, David Chen's parents, had been murdered for trying to protect children like him. The irony was devastating. He'd been saved from his parents' killers, only to be turned into the kind of weapon that might have killed them. What happened to the other survivors? Crane consulted her notes with the detached precision of someone discussing experimental data. Subject 2, Marcus Webb, was activated successfully in 1995 and operated for 7 years, before a psychological breakdown necessitated termination of his mission status. He's currently unaccounted for. Subject 3. Their names. Clay interrupted. They had names. Using their original identities compromises operational security. Their names. Crane studied his face for a long moment before continuing. Marcus Webb was originally Timothy Rodriguez. Sarah Kim became Jennifer Walsh after placement. Michael Torres and Lisa Chung, no relation to you, were assigned to deep cover operations that remain classified. 5 children who'd survived a deliberately set fire, scattered across the country, and rebuilt into weapons for a shadow war most people never knew existed. Clay thought about his own peaceful life on the ranch, the careful isolation he'd maintained, the way he'd avoided forming deep attachments that might complicate his carefully constructed existence. The rancher identity was just another cover, he said, understanding finally clicking into place. Your conditioning included multiple personality matrices. Clay Hargrove was designed to be a maintenance protocol, a stable civilian identity that could house your capabilities while keeping them dormant. But if activated, you would have access to all of David Chun's enhanced abilities. Enhanced how? Crane opened another section of her notes, revealing psychological profiles that described capabilities Clay was only beginning to recognize in himself. Perfect recall, accelerated learning, enhanced pattern recognition, resistance to interrogation, and psychological manipulation. The ability to compartmentalize trauma and function under extreme stress. The children of Project Shepherd weren't just conditioned, they were optimized. We used a combination of pharmaceutical enhancement, psychological conditioning, and what you might call programming to create individuals capable of functioning at levels far beyond normal human parameters. Clay thought about his uncanny ability to read horses, his instinctive understanding of their psychology and behavior. Skills he'd attributed to natural talent and experience might have been the result of enhanced cognitive abilities developed through childhood. Conditioning, the device. In my neck, what was its purpose? Monitoring and control. Each subject was implanted with technology that allowed us to track their location, monitor their physiological status, and if necessary, trigger activation protocols remotely. Crane's expression grew troubled. The fact that yours malfunctioned and required removal suggests either equipment failure or deliberate sabotage. Sabotage by whom? That's what concerns me. Project Shepherd was officially terminated in 1994, but certain elements within the program continued operating without oversight. Marcus Webb's recent activities suggest someone is attempting to reactivate dormant assets for purposes that may not align with original program objectives. Clay felt something cold settle in his chest. What kind of activities? 3 former government officials who had oversight responsibility for Project Shepherd have died under suspicious circumstances in the past 6 months. Each death was initially ruled accidental or due to natural causes, but the pattern suggests systematic elimination. The implications were staggering. Someone was hunting down people connected to Project Shepherd, and Clay's device malfunction might have saved his life by bringing him to federal attention before he could be silently eliminated. Am I next? I don't know, but I suspect your device didn't malfunction randomly. Someone wanted you discovered, wanted the program exposed. Crane gathered her papers with practiced efficiency. The question is whether they're trying to save you or use you for their own purposes. The truth about Clay's identity came not from government files or recovered memories, but from a manila envelope slipped under his ranch house door while he slept. He found it at dawn, his name written in careful block letters across manila paper. That felt expensive between his fingers. Inside, photocopies of documents that made his world collapse completely. His original birth certificate. Not David Chun, as he'd been led to believe, but David Michael Hargrove, son of Dr. Michael Hargrove and Dr. Elena Hargrove, research scientists who had died in 1985, not in a car accident, but in what appeared to be a coordinated assassination. Designed to look like carbon monoxide poisoning. Clay sank into his kitchen chair, studying the documentation with hands that trembled despite his efforts at control. The birth certificate was followed by marriage records, university transcripts, and employment history for two brilliant scientists whose work had focused on psychological conditioning and memory manipulation, the very techniques that had been used on him. Frank and Martha Hargrove hadn't been distant relatives taking in an orphan boy. They'd been his paternal grandparents, sworn to secrecy about his true identity and paid handsomely to maintain a cover story that kept him hidden from the people who'd killed his parents. Agent Walsh appeared on his porch 20 minutes after. Clay called the federal hotline, arriving with the kind of speed that suggested he'd been stationed much closer than officially acknowledged. But when Clay showed him the documents, Walsh's reaction wasn't the professional interest he'd expected. "Where did you get these?" Walsh demanded, his voice carrying an edge that made Clay step back instinctively. "Someone left them under my door." "Why? What's wrong?" Walsh studied the papers with the intensity of someone examining evidence of a crime, rather than revelations about Clay's identity. His radio crackled with urgent communication in codes Clay didn't recognize, and within minutes, the ranch was surrounded by vehicles that had materialized from nowhere with military precision. "Mr. Hargrove," Agent Rivera said as she emerged from the lead vehicle, "we need to talk, right now." They assembled in Clay's living room, Ravosh, and three other agents whose presence suggested this conversation was about more than identity verification. Clay found himself surrounded by federal law enforcement while holding documents that apparently represented some kind of security breach. "These documents were classified," Rivera said, photographing each page with professional thoroughness. "The Hargrove assassination was connected to Project Shepherd, but the details were sealed under national security provisions. Whoever provided these has access to information that should be impossible to obtain." Clay felt reality shifting beneath him once again. "My parents were killed because they discovered Project Shepherd. Your parents created the foundational research that became Project Shepherd," Walsh said quietly. "Dr. Michael Hargrove pioneered memory suppression techniques. Dr. Elena Hargrove developed psychological conditioning protocols. Their work was supposed to help traumatized children recover from severe psychological damage. The irony was devastating. Clay's parents had created the tools meant to heal children, only to have their research weaponized by people who murdered them for trying to stop the perversion of their life's work. He'd been conditioned using his own parents' discoveries, his identity erased with techniques they developed to help people like him. "The orphanage fire," Clay said, understanding beginning to crystallize. "It wasn't a test to find resilient subjects. It was designed to orphan me specifically." Agent Rivera nodded grimly. 7 children died to provide cover for your abduction. You were always the primary target. But why? If my parents were dead, what threat did an 8-year-old child represent? Walsh exchanged a significant look with Rivera before answering. "Your parents hid their most important research before they died. Protocols that could reverse Project Shepherd conditioning, techniques that could restore suppressed memories, evidence that would expose everyone involved in the program's illegal activities. Intelligence suggested they'd hidden the information somewhere you could access it when you were old enough to understand its significance. Clay thought about the root cellar discovery, the hidden files that had documented his conditioning. And someone's been using me as a tracking device to find that research. We think so. The device in your neck wasn't just for monitoring. It was designed to record your location data over decades. If the research was hidden somewhere you'd naturally visit as an adult, the tracking information would eventually reveal its location. The scope of the manipulation was staggering. Clay's entire life had been orchestrated not just to contain him, but to use him as an unwitting treasure hunter for information that could destroy the people who'd murdered his family. Every choice he'd made, every place he'd lived, every relationship he'd formed, all of it had been monitored and analyzed for clues to his parents' hidden legacy. "Sarah," he said suddenly, ice forming in his chest. "How long has she known?" The agent's silence was answer enough. Clay thought about Sarah's persistent concern for his health, her insistence that he see a doctor, the way she'd been perfectly positioned to drive him to the hospital when his condition became critical. A woman who ran a feed store but knew enough about document forgery to spot inconsistencies in his adoption papers. "Sarah Martinez has been your handler for the past 7 years," Agent Rivera admitted, "assigned to maintain surveillance and ensure you remain stable while the tracking data accumulated." Clay felt something break inside his chest, not just betrayal, but the devastating realization that the one relationship he'd believed was genuine had been another layer of manipulation. The woman he'd considered his closest friend, the person he'd begun to imagine sharing his life with, had been paid to watch him like a laboratory specimen. "Everyone," he said, his voice hollow, "everyone in my life has been part of this." "Not everyone," Walsh said carefully. "Pete Gonzalez is exactly who he appears to be. His presence in your life was coincidental, which is why we've been monitoring him separately. Small comfort." Clay thought about the careful isolation he'd maintained, the way he'd avoided forming close relationships, the instinctive wariness that had kept him emotionally distant from most people. His conditioning had included safeguards designed to prevent him from trusting too deeply, but those same safeguards had failed to protect him from the people assigned to manipulate him professionally. "What happens now?" Agent Rivera consulted her notes before answering. "The person who delivered these documents wants to meet with you. They claim to have information about your parents' hidden research and evidence that could expose current Project Shepherd operations." Another handler trying a different approach. "We don't think so. The documents were leaked in a way designed to force our hand, to make this conversation inevitable. Someone wants the truth exposed, and they're using you as the catalyst." Clay studied the birth certificate again, noting his parents' names written in careful script. Dr. Michael and Dr. Elena. Hargrove people he couldn't remember, but who had apparently loved him enough to hide research that could avenge their deaths and protect other children from his fate. "Where's the meeting?" "Tomorrow night." "The old Mercy House site?" Agent Rivera's tone suggested she understood the emotional weight of returning to the place where his nightmare had begun. The building was never rebuilt after the fire. It's been abandoned for nearly 40 years. Clay looked around his living room, taking in the comfortable furniture and personal belongings that had seemed to represent his authentic self just hours earlier. Now everything felt like props in an elaborate deception. Objects chosen to support a character he'd never consented to play. "Who am I supposed to trust in all this?" "Right now," Agent Walsh said quietly, "I think you can only trust yourself. The real question is whether you're ready to find out who that actually is." The journey to the Mercy House site felt like traveling backward through time toward a trauma that existed in his body, even if his mind couldn't fully access it. Clay drove his own truck, followed at a distance by federal agents whose presence provided only minimal comfort. Every mile brought flashes of fragmented memory, the outline of distant mountains, the particular quality of light as the sun descended toward the western horizon. The smell of juniper and sage, carried on desert wind, the foundation where Mercy House had stood remained visible after nearly 4 decades. A rectangular scar in the earth, marked by scattered debris and the stubborn persistence of burned timber. Clay parked 50 yards away and spent several minutes gathering courage to approach the ruins. His hand shook as he turned off the engine, not from fear, but from the way his nervous system was responding to proximity to this place. "Agent." Rivera's voice crackled through the radio earpiece they'd insisted he wear. "We've got eyes on the perimeter. No sign of your contact yet." Clay walked slowly toward the foundation, noting how his body seemed to remember the layout despite the building's absence. He knew without looking where the main entrance had been, could visualize the dormitory wing where 7 children had died in their sleep. The knowledge felt like accessing someone else's memories, but the emotional weight was entirely his own, hidden beneath a piece of corrugated metal that had survived decades of weather. Clay discovered what his contact had left for him, a waterproof container holding documents that made his parents' true story finally clear. Research notes written in his mother's careful handwriting. Video recordings of his father documenting their growing concerns about how their work was being misused. And most devastating of all, a letter addressed to their son, written in the weeks before their death. "David," his mother's voice began as he played the recording on a battery-powered device included in the cache. "If you're hearing this, then we're gone, and our worst fears have been realized. The work we developed to help children heal from trauma has been weaponized by people who see human beings as expendable resources." Clay sank onto a piece of broken concrete, listening to parents he couldn't remember explain the legacy they'd tried to leave him. The research they'd hidden contained not just evidence of Project Shepherd's crimes, but protocols for reversing the conditioning process techniques that could restore suppressed memories and return agency to the program's victims. "We've hidden the complete research data in a place you'll understand when you're ready." His father's voice continued. "Look for the constellation your mother taught you to find, the one that guided travelers home." Clay closed his eyes and tried to access memories of his mother teaching him about stars, but found only emptiness where those moments should have been. The conditioning had been thorough, erasing not just traumatic memories, but the loving foundation that might have sustained him through recovery. Footsteps on gravel announced the arrival of his contact. Clay turned to see a figure approaching from the shadow of a utility building. Clay turned to see a figure approaching from the shadow of a utility building. A Clay man roughly his own age whose movement patterns suggested military training and hard-earned caution. As he drew closer, Clay recognized something familiar in the stranger's face, though he couldn't place the connection. "Hello, David," the man said, stopping 10 feet away with his hands visible and empty. "My name is Marcus Webb, though you knew me as Timothy Rodriguez." Subject 2. Another survivor of Project Shepherd, one who, according to Dr. Crane, had suffered psychological breakdown after years of active operation. But Marcus Webb didn't look broken. He looked dangerous in ways that made Clay's conditioning respond with automatic threat assessment. "You're the one who's been killing Project Shepherd personnel," Clay said, his hand moving instinctively to the concealed weapon Agent Rivera had insisted he carry. "I'm the one who's been preventing them from activating more assets for operations that would disgrace even our makers." Marcus settled onto another piece of concrete, maintaining careful distance while projecting non-threatening body language. "Do you know what they were planning to use us for?" Clay shook his head, though part of him suspected the answer would be worse than anything he'd imagined. Domestic terrorism. False flag operations designed to justify increased surveillance and control of the American population. They wanted to activate dormant assets like us to commit atrocities that will be blamed on foreign terrorists or domestic extremists. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Clay thought about the weapons cache in his barn, the tactical training his body remembered, the way his conditioning had prepared him for violence he'd never chosen to embrace. How many others are there? Fewer now. I've been reaching out to survivors, trying to help them break their conditioning before they could be reactivated. Some chose to disappear. Others, Marcus's expression grew dark. Others were too far gone to save. Clay understood the implication. Marcus had been killing Project Shepherd assets who couldn't be recovered, preventing them from being used as weapons against innocent people. The moral complexity of the situation made his head spin. Was Marcus a hero saving victims from exploitation, or a killer deciding who deserved to live? Sarah Martinez isn't just your handler, Marcus continued. She's an active Project Shepherd operative tasked with triggering your activation when the time comes. The concern for your health, the push to see doctors, all designed to create a medical crisis that would justify intensive conditioning updates. The betrayal cut deeper than Clay had thought possible. He'd begun to imagine a future with Sarah, had allowed himself to hope that despite everything else being false, their relationship might represent something genuine. Learning that even her affection had been calculated to serve the program's needs felt like losing his parents all over again. The research your parents hid, I know where it is, Marcus said. They embedded clues in the property deed for your ranch. The constellation reference points to a specific geographical coordinate that intersects with land you legally own. Clay thought about the ranch he'd purchased 15 years ago, drawn to its isolation and the way the landscape felt familiar despite his inability to explain the attraction. They knew I'd end up there. They counted on your conditioning, including an unconscious drive to return to places that held significance for David Chun. The ranch sits on land where your family used to camp when you were very young. Your parents gambled that even with your memories suppressed, you'd be drawn back to that specific location. Agent Rivera's voice crackled through his earpiece. Clay, we've got movement on the perimeter. Multiple vehicles approaching fast. Marcus was already standing, his casual demeanor replaced by combat readiness. They found us. Sarah probably triggered a locator when she realized you discovered the truth about your identity. The sound of helicopter rotors filled the air as tactical lights swept across the Mercy House ruins. Clay found himself moving with Marcus toward better cover, his body responding to threat assessment protocols he'd never consciously learned. Whatever was coming, it represented more than federal intervention. It felt like the culmination of a decades-long pursuit that had shaped his entire existence. Clay, Agent Rivera's voice was urgent now. We're seeing federal agency markings, but these aren't our people. I repeat, these are not our teams. Marcus pulled Clay behind the concrete foundation of what had once been the building's main chimney. Project Shepherd never really ended. It just went deeper underground, with funding and oversight that bypasses normal government channels. What's coming are cleanup crews, people tasked with eliminating evidence of the program's existence, including us, especially us. We're the last loose ends, the living proof that American citizens were subjected to illegal human experimentation. For decades, Marcus checked his own weapon with practiced efficiency. Your parents' research represents the key to exposing everything, but only if we can reach it before they eliminate everyone who knows it exists. Clay thought about the peaceful life he'd built on the ranch, the simple satisfaction of working with horses and maintaining a connection to the land. That existence had been an illusion, but it had also been the closest thing to happiness he'd ever known. Now, even that refuge was compromised, his sanctuary transformed into the final battleground for a war that had been waging around him since childhood. The tactical lights were closer now, and Clay could hear radio chatter coordinating what sounded like a containment operation. Agent Rivera and her team were probably already neutralized or in retreat, leaving him and Marcus to face whatever was coming with only their enhanced abilities and the desperate hope that they could reach his parents. Hidden research before the people who'd murdered them finished the job they'd started 40 years ago. The firefight erupted with the sudden violence of lightning, transforming the peaceful desert evening into a chaos of muzzle flashes and ricocheting bullets. Clay found himself moving with reflexes he'd never trained, diving for cover behind concrete debris while his mind struggled to process the combat skills his body had retained despite decades of suppression. Marcus moved like water through the ruins, using shadows and terrain with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent years learning to survive in hostile territory. "Follow my lead," he called over the gunfire. "We need to reach the vehicles before they establish a perimeter." Clay's truck sat exposed in the clearing, but Marcus led them toward a different escape route. Dirt bike hidden behind a utility building that could navigate terrain the tactical vehicles couldn't follow. As they ran, Clay caught glimpses of their pursuers, men in dark tactical gear who moved with military precision but wore no identifying badges or unit markings. "Private contractors," Marcus explained as they reached the motorcycle. "Deniable. Assets with no official connection to any government agency. If we disappear tonight, there will be no investigation, no questions asked." The bike's engine roared to life just as tactical lights swept across their position. Clay climbed behind, Marcus feeling exposed and vulnerable as they accelerated into the desert darkness. Behind them, vehicle engines started, and radio chatter coordinated pursuit efforts that sounded disturbingly professional. The ride to Clay's ranch took 40 minutes across terrain that tested both the motorcycle's capabilities and Clay's ability to hang on while his suppressed memories continued fragmenting back into consciousness. Every jolting impact triggered flashes of training he couldn't remember receiving, tactical scenarios, weapons handling, survival techniques that felt simultaneously foreign and familiar. "The research," Marcus shouted over the engine noise. "Your parents encoded the location and the property survey markers. Look for the constellation they mentioned. It'll be marked with actual survey stakes arranged to match the star pattern." Clay's ranch appeared ahead of them, but something was wrong. Lights were on in the house, despite his absence, and vehicles were parked in his driveway with the casual arrangement of people who'd been waiting for his return. Sarah's truck sat among them, confirming his worst fears about her true allegiances. Marcus killed the engine 50 yards from the house, and they approached on foot, using the barn and outbuildings for cover. Through the kitchen window, Clay could see Sarah sitting at his table with 3 men who radiated the same dangerous competence as their pursuers at Mercy House. "Classic containment operation," Marcus whispered. "They're probably holding your friend Pete as leverage, waiting for you to come home so they can clean up all the loose ends at once." Clay thought about the older man who'd become the closest thing to family he'd had in years. Pete Gonzalez, the one person in his life who'd apparently been genuine, now trapped in a situation that existed because Clay's entire identity was built on deception and violence. "We need those survey markers," Marcus continued. "Once we have the research data, we can expose the whole program. But we have to survive long enough to get it out." They circled the house, staying low and using darkness for concealment. Clay's enhanced pattern recognition was functioning at levels that surprised him, automatically cataloging potential threats and escape routes, while his conscious mind focused on the immediate tactical situation. The survey markers would be arranged somewhere on his property to mirror his mother's constellation. But which constellation? And where would they have placed the markers to remain hidden for decades? Behind the barn, Clay found the first marker, a metal stake driven deep into the ground with symbols etched into its surface that meant nothing to casual observation, but formed part of a coordinate system when viewed as part of a larger pattern. His parents had been methodical scientists, even in their desperation, creating a puzzle that would be invisible to searchers, but solvable by their son when he was ready. Cassiopeia, Clay said suddenly, understanding flooding through him as suppressed. Memories of stargazing with his mother surfaced unbidden. The constellation that looks like a W, she used to say it pointed the way home for lost travelers. Marcus helped him locate the remaining survey markers, each one corresponding to a star, in the constellation pattern. When they connected the positions, the stakes formed a clear arrow, pointing toward a section of Clay's property he'd never had reason to excavate, a rocky outcrop that looked too solid to hide anything significant. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their discovery. Their pursuers had tracked them to the ranch, and time was running out. Clay looked toward his house where Sarah and her team waited, then at the rocky outcrop that held his parents' legacy, torn between saving Pete and completing the mission his family had died to preserve. "Go," Marcus said, reading his conflict. "I'll create a distraction and try to get your friend out. The research is more important than any of us. It's the only way to stop them from creating more victims." Clay wanted to argue, but the tactical part of his mind recognized the logic. Marcus moved toward the house with the focused intensity of someone who'd made peace with necessary sacrifices, while Clay ran toward the outcrop with his parents, coordinates burning in his memory. The hiding place was ingenious, a natural cave system that had been carefully concealed behind what appeared to be solid rock. Clay's enhanced pattern recognition allowed him to spot the artificial camouflage that had fooled casual observation for decades. Inside, protected by waterproof containers and multiple redundant storage systems, he found his parents complete. Research archive documents that proved Project Shepherd had continued operating illegally for decades. Video testimony from researchers who tried to expose the program. Medical records showing the full scope of human experimentation conducted on American citizens. And most importantly, the protocols for reversing conditioning techniques that could restore memory and agency to victims who'd been programmed to forget their own identities. As Clay gathered the research materials, gunfire erupted from the direction of his house. Marcus had engaged Sarah's team, but the firefight sounded intense enough to suggest he was outnumbered. Clay made the hardest decision of his life, trusting that Marcus could handle the immediate threat while he focused on preserving the evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy. The sound of helicopter rotors filled the air again as additional tactical teams arrived to contain the situation. Clay realized that even if he escaped with the research, he'd need help getting it to people who could act on the information. The federal agents who'd been monitoring him were either compromised or neutralized, leaving him isolated with evidence that powerful people would kill to suppress. But as he prepared to leave the cave, Clay found one final item his parents had left: a communication device with preset frequencies and encryption. Protocols that would allow him to contact journalists and oversight officials who'd been vetted decades in advance. His parents had planned for this moment, creating a dead man switch that would trigger massive exposure if their son was ever forced to activate it. The device powered up with a soft hum, its display showing multiple contact channels already established and ready for transmission. Clay looked at the research archive, then toward his house where his old life was burning down around the people he'd cared about. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back to the simple existence he built on foundations of lies. Time to find out who David Hargrove really was beneath all the conditioning and programming, and whether that person was strong enough to see justice done for the children who died to hide the truth. The transmission went out to 17 different news organizations simultaneously, carrying terabytes of evidence that would make Project Shepherd impossible to deny or contain. Clay's parents' communication device worked flawlessly, uploading encrypted files to secure servers while broadcasting real-time video, testimony from the cave where their research had waited 40 years for justice. "My name is David Michael Hargrove," Clay said into the device's camera, using his real name for the first time in decades. I am the son of Dr. Michael and Dr. Elena Hargrove, who were murdered in 1985 for trying to expose a classified human experimentation program called Project Shepherd. The words felt strange in his mouth, but each syllable carried the weight of reclaimed identity. As he spoke, the device transmitted not just his testimony, but the complete research archive, medical records, psychological profiles, evidence of illegal operations that had continued for decades beyond any official oversight. Explosions echoed from the direction of his house as the firefight intensified. Clay could see flames beginning to consume the structure he'd called home for 15 years, but the building had always been more symbol than sanctuary. His real home was the truth he was finally able to speak, the identity he was choosing to reclaim despite the conditioning that had tried to erase it. The communication device chimed softly as confirmations arrived from news organizations. The Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN, 17 major outlets were already working with cybersecurity experts to verify the transmitted files, ensuring that the evidence would survive any attempts at suppression or discrediting. Clay emerged from the cave to find Marcus approaching through the smoke and chaos, supporting Pete Gonzalez, who appeared injured but alert. Sarah was nowhere to be seen, though whether she'd escaped or been eliminated in the fighting remained unclear. "Is it done?" Marcus asked, his tactical gear torn and bloodied from the engagement. "It's done. The whole world is going to know what they did to us." Clay helped support Pete as they moved away from the burning buildings. How many of them were there? More than expected. This was a major operation designed to eliminate all evidence of Project Shepherd's existence. Marcus checked Pete's injuries with competent field medicine skills. They underestimated how much we remembered, how effective our conditioning really was. The irony wasn't lost on Clay. The same psychological programming that had been designed to make them weapons had ultimately given them the skills necessary to fight back against their creators. His parents' research had been turned against its original purpose, but it had also provided the tools for its own redemption. Government vehicles were arriving from multiple directions, legitimate federal agencies responding to reports of the gunfight and the massive data dump that was already spreading across news networks. Agent Rivera appeared among them, her professional composure cracked by relief at finding Clay alive. "The files are authentic," she said without preamble. "Intelligence committees in both houses of Congress are already calling for emergency hearings. Project Shepherd is finished." Clay watched his house burn while emergency responders worked to contain the blaze. The structure had represented 20 years of careful construction, not just of buildings, but of an identity built on artificial foundations. Its destruction felt both devastating and liberating, clearing space for whatever came next. "The other survivors," Clay said to Marcus. "The ones you've been trying to save, what happens to them now?" "The reversal protocols your parents developed. With their research public, we can help them recover their real memories, their authentic selves." Marcus looked older than his chronological age, worn down by years of carrying trauma he'd been conditioned to forget. "For the first time, we'll have a choice about who we want to be." Pete Gonzalez had remained silent through most of the conversation, but now he spoke with the careful precision of someone processing extraordinary revelations. "Son, I don't pretend to understand all this government business, but I know who you are. Clay Hargrove, David, whatever. You're the same man who's been treating horses and taking care of people for 20 years. That part wasn't fake." The observation hit Clay harder than any of the evening's revelations. Despite all the manipulation and conditioning, despite the artificial construction of his identity, he had made authentic choices about how to treat animals and people. The kindness he'd shown, the patience he'd developed, the relationships he'd built, those had emerged from whatever core of humanity had survived. Project Shepherd's attempts to erase David Chundot as dawn approached over the smoking ruins of his ranch. Clay realized that his journey was ending where it had begun, with a choice about who he wanted to become. The difference was that now he was making that choice with full knowledge of his past, armed with the truth about what had been done to him and what he'd done in response. The boy who'd survived the Mercy House fire and the man who'd built a life. Training horses were the same person, separated by decades of conditioning, but united by an essential humanity that no amount of programming could completely destroy. David Michael Hargrove was ready to discover what he could become when free, to choose his own path forward. Project Shepherd was finished. His real life could finally begin. 18 months later, Clay stood in the same desert landscape where his childhood nightmare had begun. But this time he wasn't alone, and he wasn't running. The Mercy House Memorial Garden spread before him 7 white oak trees planted in a circle around a simple granite monument listing the names of the children who had died in 1985. David Chun's name wasn't among them, because David Chun had lived to become David Michael Hargrove, and that man had lived to see justice done. Memorial dedication brought together an unlikely congregation. Families of Project Shepherd victims who'd finally learned what had happened to their loved ones. Journalists who'd spent months verifying and investigating the leaked research. Congressional representatives who championed the oversight reforms that would prevent future human experimentation programs. And scattered among them, the surviving subjects of Project Shepherd, people reclaiming their authentic identities after decades of living as someone else. Marcus Webb stood near the memorial stone, his face peaceful in ways Clay had never seen. During their desperate fight for survival, the reversal protocols from Dr. Hargrove's research had helped him recover memories of Timothy Rodriguez, a bright 8-year-old boy who loved astronomy and dreamed of becoming a teacher. The conditioning hadn't erased those dreams entirely, and Marcus was now working toward a degree in education while helping other survivors navigate their own recovery processes. David, Agent Rivera approached with the careful respect she'd maintained since the truth about Project Shepherd had emerged. She'd been cleared of any wrongdoing in the investigation that followed. Her genuine efforts to help Clay recognized as separate from the broader conspiracy. How are you feeling about today? Clay considered the question seriously. The memorial represented closure for 7 children who died to hide a government program's crimes. But it also marked the beginning of a different kind of responsibility for those who'd survived. Like I'm finally in the right place at the right time. Sarah Martinez was notably absent from the gathering. She'd disappeared during the firefight at Clay's ranch and hadn't been seen since, though intelligence reports suggested she'd fled to a country without extradition treaties. Clay found that he could think about her betrayal now without the crushing sense of personal devastation that had initially overwhelmed him. The woman he'd cared about had been a professional construction, but his feelings for her had been real. One more authentic emotion that had emerged despite the conditioning, designed to prevent such attachments. Pete Gonzalez approached with the careful gait of someone still recovering from injuries sustained during the ranch battle. At 63, he'd proven surprisingly resilient, more concerned about Clay's emotional recovery than his own physical healing. The new place is coming along well, he said, referring to the horse rescue operation they'd established on land, donated by families grateful for the truth about their missing children. That Mustang you've been working with, Thunder, he's starting to trust people again. The parallel wasn't lost on Clay. Both he and the horse were learning to overcome conditioning that had taught them to fear attachment and trust. The process was slow but genuine, built on patience rather than force, understanding rather than manipulation. Dr. Elizabeth Crane had chosen to attend the memorial despite the criminal charges pending against her for her role in Project Shepherd. At 72, she appeared fragile and diminished, but her presence represented something important: acknowledgement of harm. done and acceptance of responsibility for choices that had prioritized institutional goals over human dignity. "I know. My apologies can't undo the damage," she said when Clay approached her near the memorial stone. "But I want you to know that seeing you here, whole and choosing to help others, it suggests that perhaps something good can emerge from even our worst mistakes." Clay studied her face, noting the genuine remorse alongside the intellectual pride that had driven her original research. "The protocols you developed, the conditioning techniques, they're being used now to help people recover from cult programming and human trafficking trauma. My parents' reversal methods, combined with ethical applications of your work, are healing people instead of controlling them." It was true. The research that had been designed to create weapons was being repurposed to restore agency to victims of psychological manipulation. Clay had spent months working with therapists and researchers to ensure that Project Shepherd's tools could be transformed into instruments of healing rather than control. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the memorial garden, Clay found himself alone with the 7 oak trees and the simple stone that honored children who died for someone else's ambition. He pulled a worn leather journal from his jacket, not the ranch journal that had been destroyed in the fire, but a new one, where he'd been documenting his recovery process and his work with other survivors. The entries chronicled a journey from confusion and betrayal to understanding and purpose. Page by page, they mapped the integration of David Chun's memories with Clay Hargrove's experiences, creating a complete identity that honored both the child who'd survived trauma and the man who'd built a life dedicated to healing damaged creatures. "I remember you," Clay said aloud to the memorial stone, his voice carrying across the desert evening. "Not everything, but enough. I remember being scared and trying to help the others during the fire. I remember thinking that if I could just reach the window, I could get everyone out." The memory was fragmentary but genuine, not a product of suggestion or recovered therapy, but an authentic recollection of 8-year-old David Chun trying to save his friends. He'd failed to save them then, but he'd spent his adult life learning to rescue others, guided by unconscious instincts toward healing that no amount of conditioning could completely suppress. As stars appeared in the darkening sky, Clay located Cassiopeia, the constellation his mother had used to guide him home across 4 decades of manipulation and lies. The W-shaped pattern pointed north, toward the new ranch where horses learned to trust again and where survivors of psychological programming came to remember who they'd been before someone else decided who they should become. Clay Hargrove walked back toward his truck, leaving 7 white oak trees to grow in memory of children who died too young, carrying forward the responsibility of living authentically enough for all of them. The boy who'd survived Mercy House and the man who'd exposed Project Shepherd were finally the same person, free to choose his own path forward under stars that had waited 40 years to guide him home.